Welcome back to part two of my conversation with Jim McCarthy from Counterpoint Strategies on the Public Relations podcast. Normally, I try and keep these interviews as really short as I can, or at least I try and have conversations with people and then cut out the key parts of it for you. But in the case of Jim, he has such a different approach to media compared to perhaps many of the people that I speak to on a weekly basis that our conversation just carried on. And instead of inviting him back three times, I thought let's just get this going. So there are three parts to this interview. I thought it was going to be two, but there's three parts of it. It's quite a bit. In the first part last week, he discussed how he helps clients that are facing hostile media narratives or the public zeitgeist is against them, and then helps them to push back against that. And he does this by taking a more aggressive approach to journalists. He doesn't just go in there and try and cozy up to journalists. He tries to correct them. And he says that while that always gets a negative reaction at first, he says that overall, it helps to have a more balanced approach to the topics overall. And Jim, as the name of his organization might suggest, Counterpoint Strategies, takes on clients where the public is already, or the media or whatever, is already against them. So there can be topics that maybe you don't necessarily agree with, but from a communications point of view, it's really interesting. That was part one last week. In today's discussion, Jim really talks about the use of different voices, using pressure groups as well and influencers, and stressing the importance of the first person voice of an organization. And he says how companies can leverage public suspicion as well towards the media by taking what he describes as strong principled stance against inaccurate reporting. It's fascinating to hear, particularly if you're not used to doing this kind of approach to comms. Whether you agree with it or not doesn't matter. So I hope you find it really useful and interesting. Here is part two. Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I was gonna ask you about influencers and the effect of influencers now, because obviously the world has gone so much more beyond just journalism. But it was interesting you were just saying that about getting the different voices. And I remember, for example, during the copyright directive in the European Parliament when this was going through, and there were all kinds of little pressure groups that
Mhm.
suddenly appeared.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think this is something that is being used a lot more now. And these were people that when you look behind it,
yeah,
they were being sponsored and being organized by much bigger organizations. But as a result,
yeah.
you didn't just have one voice of one big company who said, we want this. You then had a
Right.
group of different people, different perspectives, had different reports and stuff like that to help to
Yeah,
add to that overall conversation. And I think
yeah.
that is something you've seen a lot more of over the past few years to help sort of counter points, isn't that?
That's true, but it can be a kind of sugar high for the companies, but they rely too much on those third parties exclusively, and they
Yeah.
leave out the first person voice altogether. And you see a lot of big agencies do this too, where they'll bring in stand up front group, or they'll
Mm.
manufactured activist group, or
Yes.
you know they, so they'll use that to the exclusion of the first person voice because the client might be too timid or apprehensive or have legal
Yes.
anxiety about it.
Mhm.
And again, that's okay as far as it goes, but the most credible, most impactful, quickest, best way to do it is in the first person voice, and then invite those other external groups to weigh in or take part or react.
That's really interesting. I think one of the problems you get though with the first person voice is that when you've got the zeitgeist, and of course it's a zeitgeist, it's such a general term, isn't it? But when
Yeah,
you kind of feel that there's things are moving against an organization,
yeah,
you get to the point where people almost don't want to hear what you've got to say, whether they don't want to hear whether it's true or not. They don't believe you. They've already decided. So how do you then
right.
overcome that when this whole narrative has got so negative?
Yeah. Well, I guess uh, there's a secret leverage within the zeitgeist. If we want to talk about it in the macro,
Mm,
which is that companies very rarely confront, especially national press, big 800-pound media gorillas.
mm, mm,
They're much more likely to put out a statement that's, milk watered down, milk
mm.
toast.
Just
Uh,
completely fluffy, says nothing. Yeah.
that's right. That's what the public is accustomed to hearing from
Yes.
large, let's call it Fortune 500 companies.
Yeah.
But instead, when a company stands tall and says, "Hey, the way that this major news outlet covered us is wrong. It's irresponsible. Here's why. We're not going to stand for it. Here's what we're going to do about it." It is unusual for the public. They're not accustomed to hearing that. They're accustomed to hering the ads and the press release about the philanthropy and, the CEO's the coolest guy we ever met.
Mhm.
They're not used to hearing, you know, the Times of London got it wrong and we're not going to sit still for it. And what that taps into, Richard, is an enormous reservoir of antipathy that the public has for the press.
Yes.
Readers and the public, they know whatever their opinion is of the corporate sector, they also know that the journalists slant stories, push ulterior agendas, cut corners, act unethically. And when a company stands up and takes that on in a forceful way, it again drives affinity for that. Even if the company is, a big bad chemical company or a giant manufacturer or an industrial firm, the fact that they're confronting an entity, an institution, journalism that the public itself knows is rarely held accountable, you rally a lot of support to your side, especially in credibility and in integrity.
That's interesting because I don't know what the figures are. I mean, there's all kinds of reports about it, but trust in media has dropped. People are more
Yeah.
suspicious. And it's like I was talking to an agency the other day that was working in the women's health space in India, and she was saying that in
Yeah.
the past, you could not talk about this. It was just taboo. No one would let you talk about it. But there's
Right.
been a kind of sea change in society with younger people now being prepared to talk about this. And that gave them the opportunity to then insert the campaign into that particular demographic and get the
Mhm.
conversation going. So it's kind of saying what we're saying here is that there's the opportunity because suspicion in press has decreased. I mean, it's a sad state of affairs, really, isn't it?
It is.
Both ways of looking at it. What was I going to say? Why do you think these things do change, though? Now, I mean, in that particular case with women's health, you've got a younger generation who perhaps are educated in a different way. But an example I think of is like the being overweight, obesity, whatever debate. Okay. Now, until
Yeah.
just a few years ago, to be overweight was something that you didn't want to do. Doctors were saying you
Yeah.
needed to lose weight, you needed to be a healthy weight. And now we've moved into the, rightly or wrongly, but we've moved into the body positivity sort of
Right.
narrative now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
why is it, do you think, that these narratives can change 180 degrees? What is it in society that changes that, do you think?
Well, it's good. I think that you're touching on the way that the press tries to sort of ride the crest of these, cultural waves and trends. And you do see that a lot. I mean, we're working on that right now in the one of our most beloved clients is the nicotine vaping industry.
Mhm.
And that too that whole industry and the way that smoking and nicotine and tobacco harm reduction are regarded is changing in drastic ways culturally and in the policy world. And there's a huge divide, for example, between the way the UK sees tobacco harm reduction and the way the US public health authorities see it. And so that's, a roiling sea of those undercurrents that you're talking about.
Mm.
And again, I think the key to it is not, I don't know, perhaps marketing or advertising can drive those trends to some extent, but for issues management and crisis management agencies and PR agencies writ large that are working with industries that are trying to, exist in those kinds of undercurrents, you've got to stand tall on principle. It's not enough to just let the winds of cultural change, blow about you. You have to plant a flag for principled reasons, reiterate them, stand tall for them, especially when the wind's blowing at you.
But why do you think they start? I mean, but there's so many, like with being overweight, what is it that changes in society that leads to these narrative changes? Or is it because it's the latest trend and, in a few years' time, we'll go back to sort of being that you need to be, a 1960s stick figure kind of thing?
Right.
Why is it that we get these violent narrative changes, do you think?
Well, it's that, there's a sort of the froth of the day-to-day coverage that you might see on the morning shows, for example, or in the the quasi entertainment press that covers diet changes, fads, body types, and all the things you're describing. But there was a great article in City Journal this week by John Tierney, former New York Times science writer, that I think touches on a much deeper reason, and he calls it the March of Dimes effect, where leading activist groups and large institutional NGOs may have started out with an original cause, but once that problem is solved, they then morph and have mission creep into other areas. And you see that in diet and health, and I mean, almost any space that you could name where large institutional entities and the PR firms that help them are driving narratives that help, broaden the mission, expand the scope, and evolve those activist groups into new areas. Now, a lot of times it's, in my view, illegitimate, manufactured, fabricated, but it goes a long way toward explaining the way that those narratives, emerge. And if you notice, a lot of them are aimed commercial industry.
Mm.
It's not enough to say people should eat, whatever, eat more healthy. They aim it at particular silos of the industry.
It's interesting because I think the David and Goliath narrative will always do well. It's the new activist group. I mean,
Yeah.
it's something that I think throughout my journalism career as well is that you could have a tiny group that came up with an interesting line that you could run in a story compared to the existing narrative, and you were more likely to cover it because it was a new angle. I mean,
Right.
you can criticize journalists or whatever here. You can criticize the public because we always like the new thing, don't we? But there was always this kind of feeling almost that if you said you were an activist or a campaign group, you were therefore worthy of coverage over an established organization. Now, rightly or wrongly, maybe they had a point. Maybe the established organization. But you naturally were drawn towards that David and Goliath thing. So fighting that as a bigger organization, it's always going to be a challenge, isn't it? That underlying narrative that we are drawn to.
That's right. And what's more, don't forget that the press is ideologically in sympathy with those campaigners. They're campaigners too. They just went into journalism instead of, I don't know, Greenpeace. But it's funny, if you look at the way they package those campaigns, the activists are really 30 years behind where corporate comms thinkers are in terms of messaging and packaging and delivery. You still see all the campaigners using these, dumb little PR hooks like, oh, the garbage patch in the ocean is bigger than the size of Rhode Island. I mean, that kind of PR package, like as tall as 5 Empire State Buildings. I mean, that's something that corporate companies, Fortune 500 was using 25 years ago. And it's still little cookie cutter narratives. And the reason is because it's easier for them.
It's easier for journalists as well.
That's right.
It's a nice symbiotic headline. Yeah.
It's symbiotic. That's exactly right. Yeah. And the companies that are on the receiving end of that have to be a lot more, innovative and persuasive, and they've got to think up better, newer ways to combat that. And of course,
so why
we're fighting
aren't companies using those lines then? I mean, you said earlier, and I see it all the time. You see all these corporate statements, and even as a journalist, when you used to get the press releases, you just fell asleep reading them. So why, if this stuff works, why aren't organizations using them?
Well, that's a great question, and there's it's been a dilemma, I think, in public relations for the last 30, maybe 40 years. And I from where I sit, I lay the blame at the feet of the large mainstream firms. The big global agencies like Edelman, I think, is one of the worst offenders in this. And they persuade those clients that the safer, easier path of least resistance is to conciliate, make friends with the reporters, change your business practices, pledge to, get better by, 2035. And that appeals to businesses who want to take the path of least resistance. That seems easier than getting into a fight. And it appeals to the internal legal, and it appeals to internal comms as well. And so it seems like the safer way to go. But again,
it's this classic thing of what feels like a gut feeling of what would be more comfortable than what actually works. Which is, I think, often you get in PR, don't you? You can say to people, look, you've got to have a clear statement here. And then people will go and be fluffy just because they feel it's safer and easier.
Right. What was Oscar Wilde's great line? Of all the human urges, the greatest is to change another person's copy. Get that one. That's one of the biggest problems. It's a real dilemma, and it ratchets companies into worse and worse decisions and gets them more and more captured. And it can be tough to break out from that. I mean, I understand where that anxiety comes from, but and don't forget, you touched on earlier the herd mentality. When companies do fight back like this and stand tall for themselves, one of the first things that happens that we forecast for clients is the journalists are going to say, oh, that's a terrible PR strategy. Oh, you're blaming the messenger. Oh, you can't fight with people who buy ink by the barrel. There's a whole great chorus that's out there that's going to be dissuading you from standing up for your own integrity. So it takes real leadership to pursue those strategies. But we've got case studies galore of how that works, even for clients that don't seem as appealing on the surface as you might hope.
That's Jim McCarthy from Counterpoint Strategies. Part 3 will be next week.